First to take the floor in this emotional trip is Professor Ioannis Mylonopoulos. Professor Mylonopoulos is a classical archaeologist and ancient historian trained at Heidelberg, where he completed his under and postgraduate studies and his PhD dissertation under the direction of Professor Tony Helser, focusing on the cult of Poseidon in the Peloponnese, which has been published as a supplement of Kernos in 2005. His research presents a varied and large scope, from iconographical and iconological aspects of depictions of the divine in ancient Greece to terracotta figurines as votive offerings, from architectural layout and dedicatory practices in Greek sanctuaries to the archaeology of the Peloponnese and Boeotia, from sacred space and ritual practice in Greece and Asia Minor in Hellenistic and Roman times to Greek inscriptions as a source for the history of ideas, religious identity, or social structure, etc. He is now Associate Professor at the Department of Ancient History and Archaeology, Columbia University, New York, and he is from 2014 the Director of the excavation at the Sanctuary of Poseidon at Onchestos in Boeotia. He published extensively on the above-mentioned topics of research, showing a particular interest on the role of divine images in ancient Greece, a topic on which he's actually preparing a monograph, and emotions. In respect of this last interest, he was associated with Angelos Chaniotis and Nikos Kaltsas as curators of the exhibition Emotions, A World of Emotions, Ancient Greece, 700 BC to 200 AD, first presented in New York and now present in this museum. Professor Mylonopoulos will give a paper on "We didn't need dialogue, we had faces," a visual approach to the study of emotions.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and of course, thanks to the directors of the three institutes organizing this wonderful conference. Thanks to the Acropolis Museum for hosting this conference, and of course to the Ioannis Foundation for giving us the opportunity by bringing the exhibition on emotions to Athens to be here and be talking about emotions, whether emotionally or unemotionally, it's going to be seen. So, the most famous line in Billy Wilder's critically acclaimed film noir, Sunset Boulevard, is certainly Norma Desmond's "Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up." The line, however, that captures in the best possible way the essence of the movie is, "We didn't need dialogue, we had faces." The simple sentence addresses rather brilliantly the issue whether or not emotions can be expressed adequately without words. In my paper, I will focus on visual evidence and deal with lots of faces, some relevant body parts, and ultimately raise the question pertaining to the unwillingness of the ancient Greeks to depict the kind of mental and bodily states that force an individual to open his mouth so as to reveal his teeth in laughter, pain, or pleasure. Admittedly, laughter, pain, and even pleasure are no emotions, but they can be the product of specific emotional situations or can be the trigger of certain emotions. Thus, throughout my presentation, I will keep coming back to the question whether or not we can explore emotions in ancient Greece with visual rather than textual means. Allow me to return, however, to Gloria Swanson, alias Norma Desmond. The viewer cannot but feel drawn to the huge eyes, for which, by the way, Swanson was famous, and the open mouth that exposes the teeth. Studies on emotions have long discussed the importance of the eyes and the mouth as the primary features that, thanks to countless micro-expressions, can reveal willingly or unwillingly emotions more truthfully, whatever that means, than any spoken word or even gesture. Stating that emotions are hard to grasp, or even harder to study from a purely visual art historical perspective, is a truism. In addition, since the work of the German art historian Abi Warburg, who established the notion of Pathosformel, classical archaeologists and art historians alike have fearfully avoided dealing with the subject of emotions in art in general, and Greek and Roman art in particular. The main and most obvious reason was, and partially still is, that a discipline oft accused of being subjective did not wish to deliver further ammunition to its scholarly critics. Thus, the study of emotions became rather quickly a study of texts, and Aristotle's opinions on emotions were deemed more reliable than any vase or sculpture. More than a decade ago, Ioannis Tsividis, professor at Columbia's Department of Electrical Engineering, raised in an online blog the question about the absence of laughter and emotions in Greek sculpture. Brunilde Ridgway's, back then professor at Bryn Mawr, answer to Tsividis' question is rather characteristic of a scholarly attitude in the history of Greek art that more or less consciously ignores the study of emotions as one of the possible parameters for a better understanding of ancient art. And I cite her, "Even the Hellenistic period, for all its alleged realism, may show deformity or deformation, such as swollen cheeks from blowing on the pipes, but no true emotion." End of citation. I will not even attempt to enter here a discussion about what exactly can be considered true emotion and who defines its sincerity. Having as a starting point a Western culture with a voyeuristic interest in the far too overt verbalization of emotions, the countless reality shows and their bizarre success represent the most recent sign thereof. A mother or a grandmother, as in the slide shown, gently holding a child on a Greek funerary relief are often considered emotionless, for they are not excessively emotional. Based on literary sources, art historians very often question the expression and representation of motherly emotions in Greek funerary art, and instead emphasized, for example, the interest of Renaissance artists in the depiction of various aspects of emotionality. But is Raphael's Madonna of the Meadow, now in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, more emotional than a fragmentary archaic funerary stele from Attica, shown here? In both cases, everything is about a mother or a grandmother touching her child, and motherly affection is expressed through a gentle gesture. In the case of the famous classical stele of Ampharete and the Madonna of the Goldfinch in the Uffizi, a bird complements the scene of tender emotional proximity among family members. We will never be able to reconstruct the original expressiveness of the women's faces on the two Greek reliefs, since the colors are not preserved. Nonetheless, the emotions are there, even if they don't always meet our modern expectations of what true emotions are supposed to be and how they are to be expressed and visualized. In 2008, Vaso Kindi, a philosopher, published an article in the periodical Cogito, which centered around the presence, or as a matter of fact, absence of laughter in Greek sculpture. Indeed, Kindi had been inspired by Tsividis' question and decided to contact a number of art historians and ask them to briefly address the issue. Most of the answers did refer to the smile of archaic statues, but stressed the absence of a wholehearted laughter that exposes the teeth and the interior of the mouth. Ridgway, again, emphasized in her answer that in most cases in the post-archaic statuary, the smile, I cite Ridgway, was so well hidden that we cannot see it. In our times, obsessed with a Hollywood-like smile that puts on public display the most unnaturally white teeth ever to become part of the human anatomy, a question that addresses the display of such a social status symbol like the shiny teeth demonstrating health and financial power makes indeed sense. One can stress from the very beginning that exposing one's teeth, whether in laughter or not, was certainly not something that Greek artists and the buyers of their products, we keep forgetting them, were interested in. Already Hedwig Kenner, in her brief study on crying and laughing, showed that ancient Greek artists were more concerned with finding the right ways and contexts to display sadness than they were with capturing laughing figures. At this point, I should note that modern scholars often do not differentiate explicitly enough between smile and laughter. The ancient Greek terminology is in this respect relatively clear, since it distinguishes between the midiama and the yelos. In several translations of the Iliad, for example, modern translations, Aphrodite is characterized as the one who loves to laugh, although the Homeric term Philomeides is clearly referring to the smile-loving goddess. Similarly, scholars dealing with divine images far too often refer to the laughing statue of Aphrodite Sosandra from the Athenian Acropolis, although Lucian in his Ioannis, chapter 6, explicitly refers to her majestic and secret smile, το μηδίαμα σεμνών και λελεθός. This majestic and secret smile that does not expose the teeth to the viewer is exactly what characterizes archaic Kouroi and Korai, although one has to confirm Ridgway's assessment that post-archaic statuary until the Hellenistic period is not shown smiling, not to mention laughing. This observation applies in an even more obvious way to smiling deities that remain until the end of antiquity a rarity. The case of the smiling Sosandra or the mysterious smile of the Cnidian Aphrodite, not really captured by its countless Roman copies, are the exceptions to the rule. A smile usually creates a positive impression. A smiling deity is a benevolent one, and a permanently benevolent deity is a partial one, and one you don't address with the necessary respectful fear. A god needs to be impartial, needs to incorporate in its iconography, and one should not forget that images were not a fluid moment in time, but they were there to stay, a continuous state of balance among all divine aspects a worshipper could possibly address, some of them benevolent, some of them less so. The scene on the west pediment of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia could illustrate this kind of visualization of the divine. Amidst the chaos, the hubristic sexual desire of the centaurs, and the deeply offended pride of the Lapids, there stands Apollo in the middle of the pediment with his face showing no emotional involvement whatsoever. His judgment of the crime will be based not on sympathies but on the actions of the two parties. Emotional stability allows a well-balanced judgment. We know of laughing, angry, jealous, cheating, or vindictive deities from the literary sources. But in the world of images, especially sculpture, the materialization of the divine in the form of a statue always conveys a sense of balance that avoids facial expression, smiles, and even more so, a laughter. How about smiling mortals? Their smile is also very well hidden indeed. The portrait of Themistocles, for example, shows a decisive person of action with a somewhat gloomy aura. He's a force to count with, but not an image par excellence of the friendly politician. Even the friendlier portrait of Pericles, probably finished shortly before his death, does not depict a smiling father of the state. Plutarch reveals that one of Pericles' admired qualities as a public figure was his ability to keep his face unaffected by laughter. Pericles exemplifies the serene leader who has everything under his control without smiling at and thus underestimating any danger. Is this perhaps the reason for the smileless politicians, kings, and emperors of antiquity? Emotional balance exemplified through an expressionless face. I will not address in this context interesting exceptions like the portraiture of Caracalla, of course. In addition, laughter or even a smile can have a negative connotation in terms of them being a non-verbal, ironic comment. The anecdote about Zeuxis' death is well known. The famous painter from Heraclea died of laughter after laughing too intensively at an old, ugly woman whom he was supposed to paint in a portrait. Laughter as a cause of death. A nice way to go, actually. Sorry, that was. A smiling or laughing image has a potentially ambivalent communicative relationship with the viewer. Is an image with a smile on its face simply friendly, smiling at the viewer? Is it laughing at him or her? Or is it laughing with him or her at someone or something else? This ambivalence of the smile, as I would like to call it, can be observed in Rembrandt's self-portrait as Zeuxis, now in Cologne. The Dutch painter is standing in front of the canvas on which we can detect the admittedly ugly portrait of a woman. He turns his head towards the viewer and smiles or laughs in his or her direction with raised eyebrows. We could suggest that the painter is just smiling at us and there is no subtext whatsoever in his smile. If we take, however, into consideration that although there are among the countless self-portraits of the artist, small drawing sketches of the laughing Rembrandt, this is indeed the only painted one, and I exclude here the famous painting of Rembrandt and Saskia in the parable of the prodigal son, that depicts him in this state of mind, then the artist is certainly trying to convey some sort of message. But what exactly is the meaning of his smile? is he conspiratorially laughing with us at the old female model and its vanity and ignorance? A comparison with a painting of similar subject by Rembrandt's pupil Arend van Gelder, now in Frankfurt, allows a further, perhaps even more interesting interpretation. In the pupil's painting, the model is present, and the artist with his face turned towards the viewer is laughing together with us at the ugly woman. In Rembrandt's painting, only the canvas is present, while the model and the reason for the ironic smile are absent. Is the artist actually laughing at us? Are we the vain and ignorant model for his painting within the painting? The smile in this specific case could be understood as a negatively nuanced communication between image and viewer. Is this the reason for the smileless Greek images? One cannot possibly deny that the beings that are most closely associated with the laughter exposing the teeth to the viewer are satyrs that are shown already in late archaic art with open mouths chasing after maenads or nymphs. Their laughter usually reveals the anticipated and rarely consummated pleasure of sexual intercourse. On a Kilix by Macron in Munich, for example, 3 satyrs assaulting maenads are all shown with their mouths open and their teeth exposed. The Kythera-playing satire on an early 5th century column crater now in Bonn is not placed within a sexually charged context. Together with the second satyr, who plays the flute, he frames Dionysus, who is shown holding a cantharos and the thyrsos. Nonetheless, the satire turns its head to the viewer and exposes his teeth in a laughter that is probably not simply visualizing pleasure during music making. His pleasure most probably originates in his permanently intoxicated and sexually aroused state. I will come back to this later. An early 5th century white lekithos, now in Munich, is perhaps the best example for the ambivalent nature of the satyre's laughter. The face of the satyr grins at the viewer, while the female figure right next to it appears to dance or perhaps even run away from it. Nevertheless, this mask-like presentation of the satyr's grinning face is often used for the presentation of Dionysus' face as well, as the example of a white lekithos in Palermo demonstrates. A scene on an oinokoe from the end of the 5th century showing a chariot drawn by centaurs might not be associated directly with the world of Dionysus, but the heads of the centaurs obviously bear satire-like features. Here, the centaur to the far left, I'm referring to this one over here, exposes his teeth as he laughs in devious pleasure at what his 2 companions are discussing right next to him. The way the centaur is shown observing the others from the corner of his eye and his raised eyebrow enhance the almost comedic situation. Exposed teeth behind the wide opened mouth are, however, not exclusively associated with laughter. They belong, for example, to the typical iconography of apotropaic images like the Gorgo or the Gorgonei. According to Gisela Richter's often consulted study of Greek sculpture and sculptors, the face was not, I cite her, the chief medium for the conveyance of human emotion for the archaic sculptor. End of citation. Nor was emotional expressiveness a principal aim in representations of human figures. Richter contends that archaic sculptors were not occupied with depicting the emotions because they first had to master the rendering of the human figure. We're going back to Winkelmann now. Although it is generally true that archaic sculpture is not as emotionally expressive as that of subsequent periods, a variety of emotions can be observed in sculpture of the late archaic period. A metope from Temple F at Selinous depicts a scene from the Gigantomachy in which an Olympian goddess strides forward and tramples her opponent. A number of elements are combined in this composition to communicate the giant's agony and impending death. The giant, writhing under the weight of the goddess's crushing foot, tilts his head back to extend fully his neck. The helmet is not drawn over the giant's face and appears to slide off his head, which perhaps communicates the force with which the giant is knocked to the ground. What comes as a surprise is neither the posture of the giant nor the overall compositional scheme of a victor stepping over his enemy, but rather the intensive moment of both bodily and psychological pain that comes with the realization of one's unavoidable death that the facial features are trying to convey. In addition to this, and from an art historical perspective, the meticulous dedication of the artist to the depiction of every tiny detail is nothing less than stunning. The eyes of the giant are narrowed to a squint and his mouth opens to expose both rows of teeth. the impact of the teeth's exposure is heightened by the visual demarcation of each individual tooth. One has to imagine the original impact of these exposed teeth to the viewer when they were still painted in white. In the early classical period, a metopy on the eastern side of the so-called temple at Selinous again depicts Heracles and an unknown Amazon engaged in battle. Heracles lunges forward to deliver the mortal blow. The scene does not explicitly portray the death of the Amazon, as did the Gigantomachy scene from Temple F, but she must be fully aware of what is to come. Her lips are stretched horizontally, her teeth are exposed and yet again very well demarcated. Can we suppose that fear or even agony is present on the Amazon's face? On the contrary, the face of the hero is calm and composed. Heracles gives no visible indication of effort or discomfort, although he does battle a very powerful opponent. One could hypothesize that these two rather unusual images come from Magna Grecia, from Selinous, a Greek colony with intense relations to the indigenous population, so that the art of this city could not be considered typically Greek. Yet, the Athenian Parthenon has something similar to offer. The temple's south metopy too depicts a considerably intense duel between a Lapith and a centaur. The Lapith drives his opponent to the ground and grasps tightly the centaur's neck. The human hero digs the tips of his fingers into the centaur's throat. In response to being choked, the centaur tilts his head up and shifts his eyes up towards the sky in a look of bodily suffering and despair. His forehead furrows and his eyebrows press in towards his nose. His mouth is stretched horizontally and fully open. We can see not only both rows of his teeth, but the inside of his mouth. One can imagine that the centaur is in such fear that he cries aloud in agony. It is interesting to know that in vase painting too, the exposure of the teeth to the viewer was often used as a visual means in order to express the struggle of an anti-hero or even an animal trying in vain to resist the deadly embrace of a hero. In most scenes depicting Heracles' fight against the Nemean lion, for example, the hero's face remains expressionless. In this case, emotionless means effortless. The hero shows no signs of struggle, while the animal is shown in his unsuccessful fight to avoid death with his mouth open and the teeth emphasized through white paint. Even more interesting is the way Euphronios distinguishes between Heracles and Antaios on the famous crater in Paris. Heracles' face is entirely calm, the mouth is closed without the lips being even pressed against each other, and the eyebrows reveal no sign of the struggle. On the contrary, Antaios' mouth is wide open and his teeth exposed, while his thick eyebrows are pressed against the nose, a way to depict the agony of the anti-hero about to be defeated and ultimately die. The metopes from Selinous and Athens and the two vases with scenes from Heraclean narratives that I briefly discussed show creatures in pain and or struggle that have well-known negative connotations, and in the case of giants, Amazons, and centaurs, have often been identified as the most prominent exponents of what the Greeks understood as the other. Their moments of bodily pain and mental agony are visually enhanced through the exposure of their teeth. Heroes, on the contrary, tend to suffer in stoic calmness and with their mouths closed. There is, however, an interesting and rather early exception as regards the exposure of the teeth by a member of the Greek elite as an expression of agonizing pain. On the interior of a red-figured Kylix, the so-called Sosias painter shows young Achilles taking care of the older wounded Patroclus. Patroclus is pushing his foot in pain against the frame of the image, a rather ingenious use of the frame as part of the action. At the same time, he is looking away from his wound with his mouth opened. The painter accentuates this break of visual rules by the use of white added paint for the teeth. This is, in my view, an attempt by a vase painter to genuinely represent the real pain felt by a warrior and not an idealized world of images in which heroes die with their bodies pierced by countless weapons, but with the most serene face possible. We have seen so far images of satyrs exposing their teeth in an almost obscene laughter, but also mythological figures who expose their teeth in situations closely associated with intense pain or the agony of imminent death. In my view, however, exposing one's teeth is most often a feature that reveals a sexually aroused and usually also intoxicated figure. Usually, a half-opened mouth with no exposure of the teeth is considered characteristic of the sensuality of 4th century sculpture or the pathos whatever that means, of Hellenistic imagery. There are, however, several figures from Olympia that show this very same figure, such as the so-called seer from the east or one of the attacked lapiths in the west pediment. The latter might have even exposed his teeth to the viewer, since, like Patroclus on the Kylix by the Sosias painter, he is in excruciating pain while being bitten by a centaur. The figure of Heracles in the metope, depicting the Cretan bull labor is also shown in his struggle with his mouth opened, but without exposing his teeth. However, if one looks closely at the centaurs on the western pediment, one will notice that all three that have their heads preserved expose their teeth to the viewer. The so-called biter uses his teeth as a weapon, highly reminiscent of the biter group from the Pergamon frieze a couple of centuries later. The exposure of the teeth in this case appears almost natural, and is in the context of the depicted narrative sequence unavoidable. This does not apply to the two centaurs attacking female lapiths on both sides of Apollo. Besides the struggle involved, and one should note that they are both about to be attacked, probably by Theseus and Perithous, the open mouth and the exposed teeth reveal in my view their bodily and mental state. They are sexually aroused and intoxicated. Sexual arousal and intoxication bring centaurs and satyrs together. A small mid-6th century Erybalos by Nearchos in the Metropolitan Museum bears an especially graphic representation of three ecstatic satyrs masturbating. The two satyrs in profile are throwing back their heads and open their mouths in a moment of absolute ecstasy and self-pleasure. Both satyrs are exposing their teeth that are rendered in added white paint. Interestingly, the satyr's name in the center is Terpekelos, which means nothing but the one who brings pleasure to his own shaft. A satyr on a late archaic amphora is representing a very similar moment of pleasure. He is masturbating with his mouth wide open and his teeth exposed. A late 6th century Kylix by the Nicosthenes painter in Kassel also catches a satyr in a moment of self-pleasure. With his open mouth that exposes his teeth, the satyr has turned his tender affection towards an amphora. Sex and wine connect the famous statue of the drunken old woman to the satyrs and centaurs we just saw. The Roman copies in Munich and Rome have been convincingly interpreted as copies of a high Hellenistic original representing a former prostitute. The explicitly ugly female recalls under the influence of wine her past sexual adventures while attending a Dionysian festival in Alexandria. It would be impossible to repeat here the exhaustive analysis of every single detail of the statue's iconography offered by Paul Zanka. For the purpose of my paper, it suffices to concentrate on the motif of the thrown back head of the image that connects the statue to the sexually ecstatic figures of the satyrs on Nearchos' Erybalos. The Hellenistic drunken old woman does only represent an intoxicated individual, but also does not only represent an intoxicated individual, but also a person at the verge of society, comparable to the statue of the fisherman in the Vatican, or the two heads of old women in Dresden and London that also open their mouths and present their teeth, or lack thereof, to the viewer. Around the same time, the subject of a grinning satyr exposing his teeth to the viewer attracts the attention of sculptors, and Roman copies attest to the popularity of this particular motif. I have shown elsewhere that the grinning satyrs of the Hellenistic period might have their origins in the more delicately smiling satyrs of the 4th century that we usually associate with Praxiteles. However, the delicacy of the facial expression of the Praxitelian satyr, who only minimally exposes his teeth, is now transformed into a devious, almost obscene laugh that exposed the teeth. Countless statues of laughing satyrs must have populated Hellenistic sanctuaries and gardens, transforming definitively the broad grin into an attributive feature of a satyr's physique. This is probably where the paretymological explanation of the word satyr originates that Elian preserves in his Varia Historia. Satyrive apo tou se serenai. They are called satyrs because they show their teeth, from Cyrene. The last examples of sculpture that I present demonstrate a well-known fact. The Hellenistic period saw a significant increase in the visualization of emotions, not only in the minor arts, but more importantly in monumental sculpture as well. For example, the so-called Pergamon frieze is filled with figures unequivocally showing their deathly agony, and the monument is often used as the perfect example of the much-cited Hellenistic pathos. Looking at the face of the giant attacked and forced to the ground by Athena, one is reminded of a poster by Louva published in London in 1944, a comparison drawn by Kati Maderna in her seminal paper on facial expressions in Greek art under the title Von der Ordnung der Mimik, bedrohliche Leidenschaften in der antiken Bildkunst. We see the hands of the French resistance coming out of the flames in the colors of the French flag throttle a Nazi soldier. The Nazi soldier throws his head back in an almost Hellenistic way, just like the giant of the Pergamon frieze, the diachronic iconography of the defeated and much hated adversary. Allow me to push Maderna's comparison even further. The Nazi soldier is not only throwing his head back, he also opens his mouth, exposing his teeth and apparently revealing his agony. The Pergamon frieze brings back the discussion about the striking difference between the divine and the non-divine face that we encountered already in the west pediment of Olympia. Despite the fact that the faces of the so-called Olympians have suffered unequally larger damages than the face of the giants, we can still observe the total absence of emotions from the faces of the gods when compared to the ferocity or the agony of the literally malformed faces of the giants. The discrepancy has been often explained by the usual equation emotion equals hubris, chaos and barbarism, versus absence of emotion equals civilizing power, serenity, Greek identity. The deformed face of Marsyas, who exposes his teeth in agony, seems to confirm this hypothesis, since Marsyas's hubristic attitude ended in his deformed face in anticipation of the cruel punishment. The equally hubristic Laocoon and his sons, who in addition are also non-Greeks, are shown in the moment of their agonizing death with bodies wildly trying to escape the two snakes, with faces deeply wrinkled and open mouths that expose the teeth to the viewer in a desperate but vain scream for help. A relatively neat interpretive model arises. The good Greeks smash apparently in perfect emotional balance their barbaric emotional adversaries. If this holds true, how are we then to explain the facial expression of the bearded figure of the so-called Pasquino group? The group has been identified as Menelaus with the body of Patroclus or Ajax with the body of Achilles. Either way, the face of the older warrior is showing despair, agony, or at least intense physical struggle. This is not the face of a Homeric hero about to preserve the honor of a fellow combatant by rescuing his dead body from the battlefield for the proper funerary rites. Centuries after the killings by the Sosias painter, a Homeric hero is shown again with his mouth open and his teeth exposed. The Hellenistic group of Achilles and Penthesilea, the two heads are here in the exhibition, demonstrates a similar approach to the visualization of the heroic struggle, albeit far less dramatic. Achilles does have an open mouth and his teeth can be seen, but the rest of his face, as opposed to the face of Menelaus or Ajax, remains divinely calm. No single explanation can be applied to all these examples. Instead, the art historian is called to understand the finely tuned sense of occasion behind every single image. The gods on the Pergamon frieze seem to follow a very long iconographic tradition of emotionally balanced divine beings. The agony of Marsyas, Laocoon and his sons, as well as the giants, is also visualized following a tradition that allows, perhaps even expects, the others to react differently to pain and agony. The expression of struggle on the face of Menelaus or Ajax, and even on the face of Achilles, is more passive. In previous centuries, heroes achieved or had to achieve everything effortlessly. The absence of effort elevated the achievement. Apparently, in Hellenistic times, it was the effort along the way, and not only the final result, that could at least occasionally be seen as a parameter that further dignified heroic achievements. We should raise the question whether this kind of emotional involvement was expressed before the Hellenistic period. The answer is not a straightforward one. In scenes of duels between two fully armed warriors, a theme popular among archaic vase painters, fear or agony in the eyes or facial expressions of the opponents is usually absent. One, of course, should stress the importance of gestures for the process of visualization of emotions. how gestures can convey emotions or at least create an emotionally charged context can be detected, for example, in such scenes in which the defeated adversary is lying on the ground and tries to touch the chin or the knee of the victor. It is this gesture that expresses visually the fear and the recognition of the shameful defeat, while the face remains, in several cases, emotionless. There are, however, some examples that show so-called micro-expressions accompanying the more obvious and easily recognizable gestures. On an icosthenic amphora of the late 6th century, for example, a warrior is shown chasing a woman, a scene without accompanying inscriptions that could be read by the viewer either as a specific representation of Menelaus chasing Helena or as a generic image reproducing the dangers women faced in times of war. Be that as it may, the face of the female figure does demonstrate the well-hidden, I'm citing Ridgway, emotion of fear. The eyebrows are not running parallel to the eyes, as is usually the case, but are instead turned upwards, while the line of the mouth is turned downwards, clear signs of distress and despair. One can also check the face of Menelaus on an Apulian volute crater of the mid-4th century depicting the heroes and Helena's encounter at the statue of Athena. The eyebrows stretch towards the root of the nose, but more importantly, the angrily pressed lips express the emotional state of the Greek warrior. If we compare the face of the anonymous female figure with the face of Cassandra about to be raped by Ajax on the slightly later Hydria by the Cleophrates painter, we will see what usually happens in thus painting. The gesture of Cassandra expresses the fear, while her face perfectly fits the image of female beauty, undisturbed by unwelcome movements of the eyebrows or the mouth. A facial expression of despair with raised eyebrows and eyes slightly turned upwards can be also seen in the tonto of an early 5th century Kylix depicting the murder of Troilos by Achilles. Troilus' vulnerability and fear are further emphasized by the complete frontal view of the face, something thus painters usually avoid or employ in representations of figures such as Gorgo. A deformed face causing fear or expressing fear is presented frontally to the viewer. In addition, Troilus' face anticipates the agony of the giant of the Pergamon frieze about to be slaughtered by Athena, just like the figure of Ge in the tonto of the late 5th century Kylix by Aristophanes anticipates the despair of Ge's figure on the Pergamon frieze. Both figures raise their hands and throw back their heads in a moment of desperate begging. It seems that exposing one's teeth is associated with very specific bodily and mental states: drunkenness, defeat, angst, pain, realization of one's imminent death, and sexual arousal. However, the situations I just mentioned are per se no unusual topics in Greek art. We can easily identify countless images of drunken, even vomiting participants of symposia, defeated or dying heroes and Greek soldiers, or Athenian citizens involved in sexual intercourse with prostitutes. The exposure of teeth in moments of utter pain, exuberant pleasure, or agonizing fear characterizes primarily creatures such as centaurs or satyrs that are consumed by their passions, and individuals at the verge of society who do not conform with societal rules of proper conduct. The Kylix by the Sosias painter is in this respect a brilliant exception. Patroclus' open mouth with the exposed teeth adds a deeply human aspect to the heroic scene. It is as if the artist is visually commenting on the human characteristics of any given hero, so intensively portrayed in literature and fiercely avoided in imagery. But his approach did not have any significant impact on other artists. Only in the Hellenistic period will artists return to visual means that emphasize the humanity of Greek heroes, creating a smoother bridge between the literary and the visual constructions of the heroic. Until this time, it is the others who almost exclusively expose their teeth and their emotions to the viewer. They might experience the same feelings of fear, agony, or sexual arousal like any Greek, but they allow themselves to physically demonstrate their reactions. They turn their inner, unruly situation into a visibly perceivable facial expression that deforms their appearance. It comes as no surprise that persons too are often shown with open mouths and exposed teeth, as the example of a Kylix crater in Basel demonstrates. The point is not avoiding pain, pleasure, fear, or even death, but how to deal with them. It is about whether pain or pleasure control you or you them. Plutarch is not calling Pericles a humorless individual, although I suspect he was one. He simply emphasizes that the Athenian politician would not allow his face to be transformed into a mask by laughter. He most probably smiled majestically and secretly at his fellow Athenians. Are, however, archaic and classical images expressing emotions with the same intensity like Hellenistic ones? Certainly not, since the degree of emotionality visualized in the Hellenistic period cannot be matched by any image created in the preceding periods. And yet, even this observation needs to be further specified. Emotions reflected in facial expressions are rare in archaic and classical art, although they do exist. We just need to study them. On the contrary, gestures as a further non-verbal expression of emotions are truly no invention of the art of the Hellenistic period. In conclusion, the question about the absence of or presence of emotions in art cannot be easily answered. Probably it is not even the right answer to ask, for emotions are always present in Greek art, and only the degree of their visibility varies. Archaic and classical art appears less emotional if we concentrate solely on facial expressions or gestures, but it does attempt to evoke emotions. The famous amphora by Exekias depicting the suicide of Ajax in Boulogne-sur-Mer shows an admittedly expressionless hero preparing his own death. Artists before and after Exekias prefer to depict this theme in a quite graphic, even gory way. The hero lies already dead, face down on the ground, with his body brutally pierced by the sword. Exekias' version is not shocking. It is instead emotionally moving, for it forces the viewer to participate in the tormenting soul-searching and the final resignation that leads to the act of suicide. The scene is not emotional, but is certainly emotive. The aforementioned Hellenistic statue of Marsyas is clearly depicting the emotional state of mind of the about-to-be-skinned satyr. The statue depicts emotions and attempts to provoke emotions at the same time. This is, in my view, one of the main differences between archaic, classical, and Hellenistic art when it comes to the depiction of emotions. The one is rather emotive than emotional, while the other is both emotive and emotional. There can be no doubt that ancient Greek artists were deeply interested in the depiction of emotions, even if at times they felt they were unable to represent them properly. Celebrated among Roman viewers was a painting by the early 4th century artist Timanthes, probably from Sicyon, that showed Iphigenia at the altar in Aulis. The object is in the exhibition. In the words of Pliny, upon the faces of all present grief was depicted. But having already exhausted all the characteristic features of sorrow, the artist adopted the device of veiling the features of the victim's father, finding himself unable to adequately give expression to his feelings. For some emotions, neither words nor images seem to ever be adequate. Thank you for your patience.